Hello, and welcome to the Questions and Answers edition of the Thriving Kids podcast from the Child Mind Institute. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Anderson. Last week, I sat down with Dr. Shelby Harris, a clinical psychologist and behavioral sleep specialist, to talk about one of the biggest challenges parents face: helping kids wind down and actually fall asleep. We explored why so many families get stuck in bedtime battles, how to build routines that actually work, and what healthy sleep habits look like at different ages. This week, I'll be answering your follow up questions about how to help your child build independent sleep skills with less stress for everyone involved. Let's get into it. Our first question for the Q&A episode of the Thriving Kids podcast this week on sleep is a doozy, and it's terrific. My almost 10-year-old still won't fall asleep unless I lie next to her. How do I help her learn to fall asleep on her own? First of all, I just want to commend the parent who sent us this question for their courage, because we hear a lot of parental shame when parents are still lying next to kids in, say, late elementary school, because they feel like what they're being told is like, your kid should be able to go to sleep by themselves, like sleep training should work, and you should sleep train your kids at earlier ages, and that kind of thing. One thing I often start with when I get this question is that co-sleeping is actually quite common across world cultures. I think that within American culture, we tend to have a focus on the idea that kids should go to sleep by themselves. And the reality is that this balance looks different for every family. Some parents really like cuddling their kids at night and just feeling that there's that moment of connection. Some families co sleep. In some households, the parents and kids might be going to sleep at about the same time. We hear of parents who sometimes are sleeping, in the kids' rooms with them. All kinds of sleeping configurations are, of course, okay and dependent on family structure and living arrangements. But if this question is coming from a place that says, look, there are separate sleeping spaces for a 10-year-old and a parent, you know, if the parent still wants the 10-year-old to kind of fall asleep without the cuddles or the lying next to them, there's a process we can work through. And the best way we do this is we talk to parents about behavioral shaping. We say, look, let's take the steps from, you lying next to your child and the fact that you're there to help them settle their body down and getting them to sleep independently. It's very rare that it works to just kind of go cold turkey, like to be like, look, you turned 10, it's time for you to go to sleep by yourself. And some kids, they will actually tell you, like, I'm ready for this, I'll do this. But what we want to think about here at the most kind of gentle level is saying to a 10-year-old, look, honey, like, I love you. It is really wonderful to get to cuddle. I want us to have that cuddle time. Happy to do that during other hours other than when we fall asleep. But I want us to focus, especially as you're getting older, on you being able to go to sleep independently. That doesn't mean that I want to just leave your room immediately, but let's start thinking about that. And a lot of times we'll try to get the 10-year-old involved in the discussion and saying, okay, we might start off, and there might be certain nights of the week that we lie down, and certain nights of the week where we sit in a chair next to you, or where we sit in a chair outside of your room. And we're just kind of going through a process of fading the parent out from lying next to the child, to perhaps being next to the bed, to perhaps still being in the same room, to maybe being outside of the room, to maybe checking on the child, to eventually having the child fall asleep by themselves. Now, we can accelerate this process, oftentimes through external reinforcers, in that we can say to kids, look, if you're able to let me go and do the dishes and then come back and check on you in 10 minutes to see how you're doing, like, that could be a check or a sticker toward a certain reward the kid is working toward, like an activity or outing or meal on the weekend or extra dessert or, some extra time in a preferred activity, something like that. We can always kind of boost it with these reinforcers. But at the end of the day, it's usually a process. It's usually about challenging a kid, but not causing them so much distress that they can't really fall asleep, and kind of working through it gradually. And if you find yourself having real difficulty with this, there are always therapists who coach people through these processes and try to help make it so that kids can go to sleep on their own if you would like us to help. And we hope that you reach out to, perhaps a counselor or someone who's a developmental specialist for kids or something like that if you feel like you need guidance. Not to mention that, as you might have found out from our podcast episode this past week with Dr. Shelby Harris, she has books and a lot of online resources that might be able to help you through this process. Our second question: what should a child's bedroom actually look like for good sleep? This was one that we covered in great detail on our previous podcast episode with Dr. Harris, where I will just paraphrase and say that Dr. Harris looked at this as the room should be cool, comfortable, and dark. So when we look at a kid's bedroom, Granted, clutter, which could be like another C word in there, might be somewhat distracting for good sleep. Like I think about, especially with our 9-year-old and 6-year-olds, or sorry, our 9-year-old and 6-year-old, my kids, just that, like, they like to have a lot of stuff near their bed, and my 6-year-old daughter in particular really likes to have a lot of cuddly loveys and things like that. My son likes to include all manner of sports memorabilia and vehicles near his bed, and at the end of the day, having that stuff very close to the bed can sometimes be distracting or can kind of crowd them out for the space that they need for sleep or even make them hot, which is a no-no. But so what we're thinking about is how do we make their bedding as comfortable as possible? How do we make the room cool? And how do we make the room dark? We have, shades that really block out light for our kids. We try to make sure as well that it's a quiet space as much as we possibly can. And then we try to see how well we can make that space of a cooler temperature. And that tends to be facilitative of good sleep. I'm going to get into it in a few or at a later question in this Q&A episode about kind of sleep hygiene. But that's also an aspect of how we make sure that kids are ready for good sleep. And sleep hygiene is basically just a fancy term for the routine you go through on the way to sleep. So, our next question: how long should a bedtime routine be? And when does calming turn into stalling? So, as you might expect, because psychologists, mental health professionals, we tend to hedge on these questions. Uh, we don't necessarily have a particular time where we're suddenly saying to a parent, like, look, it's been 5 minutes. You've got to be out of that kid's room. What we think about is more about sleep hygiene, as I just referenced. It's that as we're looking at an evening as it unfolds for a family, we're starting to ask about certain questions that are well outlined, I would say, in childmind.org articles on sleep hygiene that you can find on our website. But we're saying, okay, when do you have dinner? After dinner, how are we making sure that all routines and activities are really moving us toward bedtime? In the sense that, are we dimming lights in the house? Are we doing activities that we feel like are helping our body to calm? Are we stopping screens and screen based activities, a certain period of time before bedtime? Hopefully we can. Are we going through a routine where maybe it includes showers or bath? Maybe it includes, well, not maybe, but it should include brushing teeth or, something that is related to cleaning our teeth each night. Are we doing something where we read a book or we spend a moment, to chat or talk about the day with our kids? And we really want to make that into a routine where each of these things becomes a kind of behavioral cue for a kid that they are relaxing into sleep. And then once we actually get to the point where we're meant to get in bed, lots of kids stall for all kinds of various reasons. We try to give them a certain amount of grace. They'll remember they have to go to the bathroom. They'll remember they had to put on socks. They'll remember that they, need a drink of water, something like that. We always tell parents, like, we try to not get too angry in that moment because, again, we're trying to calm for sleep. If kids need to do those extra couple things, lots of parents will try to engage in what we would think of as an antecedent intervention, where they say, how can I get all these things ready? So, like, I'll remind them to go to the bathroom. I'm going to put a cup of water right next to their bed. I'm going to make sure that they have socks on before they get in. I'll make sure their bed is tucked in the way that it is and that they've got, the loveys they want to sleep with or the animals or something like that. And we might give a kid a moment of grace where maybe we're talking for a couple minutes, or we're singing a song, or we're saying a goodnight ritual. We say goodnight to them as well as their bear and another animal. But at the end of the day, we should be able to have some facet of the ritual that involves us leaving the room and being able to say, okay, we are calm to this point. The kid's going to sleep, and we're kind of off into night night and dreamland. Um, and if we look at kind of the beginning of the ritual where maybe we're starting to say brush teeth and do calming activities for bed, that could be a half hour. If we're looking at what happens from the moment we say, okay, it's time to get in bed, to the moment we leave a kid's room, that can still be a few minutes of just us settling down and being able to say goodnight to a kid. At the same time, if we see parents where they say, look, we have this 30-minute runway, and then I'm in the room and I can't seem to extricate myself for another 30 minutes, sometimes we get up to 45 minutes, those tend to be situations where we will take a critical look with parents and say, okay, what is getting in the way? What is stalling? How can we either reinforce a kid allowing the bedtime routine to be shorter or remove some of the things that could be stalling for a child and really take a look at kind of the landscape of that situation, doing as much as we can to say, catch the kid being good when they're allowing the bedtime routine to proceed expeditiously. And at the same time, if we need to have a consequence where we say, look, if it lasts too long, or if you refuse to get in bed, or you're getting out of bed, or you're doing other activities, there may need to be a loss of a privilege the next day that comes along with stalling at bedtime. And those are a lot of things we'll talk through with parents. Our next question: my 9 year old gets scared at night. How do I tell what's normal fear versus anxiety that needs more support? First of all, a lot of kids are afraid of the dark. A lot of kids are afraid once they have nightmares. A lot of kids have really vivid dreams. A lot of kids have things that recur to them at night because the darkness brings back flashes of movie scenes or TV show scenes or things that a friend described or images of Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, like it occurred for me because I was really into cryptids around this age of late elementary school. But we expect a certain amount of fear. We also expect that if it's in this range where you might not need extra support, that fear might be infrequent and easily settled. So, what I go back to is the acronym that we often use for things that we think need extra support, which is that we say to parents, think about frequency, intensity, duration, and impairment, or FIDI. If parents say to us, this kid is getting up every single night, multiple times a night, they're very anxious, or every night they have something they're anxious about and they wake us up in the middle of the night, or when they do wake us up, it's only a few times a week, but it's super intense. They're crying and they can't seem to get back to sleep, those types of things, or it's been going on for a really long time, that can be a situation where we need more support. If, on the other hand, your kid has just woken up once and it's the first time in a few weeks and they woke up with a nightmare and they called for you and asked for you to come in and talk to them for a second. That tends to be a situation where we'll tell a parent, look, that's a single data point. Maybe we don't need to decide we need a whole new plan for middle of the night and that this is just a fear that kid might have had. Or you go to a different place to sleep and the kid's really scared of the dark. Again, these are situations where are built to kind of have the resilience to confront these situations together with their parent, helping them to kind of regulate and understand that they can confront their fears. But if parents say, I'm banging my head against a wall, it happens so often or it's so intense, those can be situations where we need more support at night and where we need to help a kid to figure out how they can make use of developing coping skills that can help them be brave in those situations and know that that's actually a false alarm bell that's happening for them at night. Our next question: my child insists that their phone or tablet, or sorry, my child insists they need their phone or tablet to fall asleep, but I've heard screens make sleep worse. How do I handle that without a meltdown? We get this question a lot because it's not just kids or teens or adults, it's everybody that is tending to find it difficult to leave screens behind for sleep. And we frequently hear parents say, my child or teen says they need to listen to music, or they need to listen to a book on tape in order to fall asleep, or they need the phone for the alarm. So that's why they've got to keep their phone in their room. Uh, at the Child Mind Institute, across our mental health professionals, what I will say is there's fairly good consensus that if we can keep screens out of the bedroom, we're going to do everything we can to try. Because while a lot of the narratives around screens that we see in the media can be quite sensational and strike fear into the hearts of parents, there are real risks with social media, for example, and there are real risks to sleep with screens. We see that impact across all sleep research, not just for children and teens, but also for adults, where we as a society right now are sleeping less when screens are in our bedroom because they are machines that have us scrolling, clicking, liking, commenting, interacting, playing games, doing any number of things that do not necessarily allow our brains to settle down into sleep. So, you may have heard Dr. Harris and I speaking about this last week, and you'll at least, I can kind of rephrase this now. If a child is saying they need something like this to fall asleep, my first thought is usually I want to honor what their sleep hygiene is, or the fact that they really feel like this helps them to calm down. And then I want to do two things. I want to see if I can find a non screen based solution for it. And then, secondly, I also want to really do some experiments where I might say to that kid, I hear you that you feel like you need this. Can we try a couple different things in your sleep routine? Like, can I have you read a physical book or a physical magazine? Can I have you perhaps listen to something that would only be able to be listened to and doesn't involve a screen? Can I have you do a meditation routine instead of what you're typically used to? And again, The meditation routine, by the way, for young kids doesn't have to be too overwrought. This might be like a 1 minute or a 3 minute body scan. But frequently, as we do those experiments, kids will come back and say, "Oh, that's not the only way that I can get to sleep. You were right. I can cultivate my hygiene in this way." And I will also just say that for a very low price, across many different websites, you can find an alarm clock that is not a phone, that can be placed in your kid's room and often is more effective than having the phone be in there. Our next question: at what age should we start shortening or dropping daytime naps? This is a great question for kind of the 0 to 4 age range. Um, and when we look at this, there's a lot of variation in terms of how much kids need naps. Like just as an example, both of our kids really stopped napping at 3. They were still in preschool classes where at ages 3 and 4, they still had nap time each day. Our preschool teachers for our son told us that he would sit underneath the desk and play with cars so as not to disturb the nappers. Our daughter would just sit on a cot, even around the nappers, and be very quiet and read books, although there were some days where she got tired enough to nap. A lot of times we're just looking at kids' sleep habits. It's that, when we see younger kids, say 3 or under, um, what we'll see is that there's often still a need for a daytime nap because if for some reason they don't get that rest time in the middle of the day, there's a lot more emotional volatility later in the day, a lot more tiredness, disruptions to the sleep schedule, things like that. And consistency is really key for a lot of kids in learning great habits around sleep in the early years. What we'll often talk to parents about is they'll say, well, the nap is really good for me. It's at least a quiet time in the middle of the day where I can think for a second, maybe like get a couple of my own tasks done or exercise or just, I don't know, sit and stare at my phone or the wall just for a second to collect my thoughts. And that's something that like is really helpful for me. So there's often like two forces in this equation where one of them is the kid's need for a nap and the other is the parent's need for a break. And we'll kind of try to think through this and say, look, you know, if you really need this break and at the same time you're still getting some, level of success around your kid's daytime nap, like maybe they're not napping every day, maybe sometimes they sit quietly in their room, and they might only nap briefly or lie down briefly, but it's still at least a break. And then like say a certain percentage of the time they really are still napping. That's really great. Um, Frequently, the discussions about ending naps tend to be that the child is A, either just no longer seeming that tired at this stage and staying awake, and B, that, later on in the day, they may not even seem as tired. Or you might find that by giving them a daytime nap, and this is what we found with our kids, they couldn't fall asleep as early. And so their bedtime was getting pushed later and later. And so we had to kind of make a decision related to their sleep to say, look, they're going to get their sleep. They're either going to get less sleep at night and a nap, or they're going to get no nap and a full night, at least as we were seeing it, of sleep. And that becomes something that you're just kind of navigating together as parents. I will not say there's a perfect formula. I would say there's just a number of factors where we're trying to optimize how to make sure a child is getting the rest they need, how to make sure that we're having that sort of quieter rest time in the middle of the day in line with what's typical and appropriate developmentally for kids like this, and at the same time, making sure that we hopefully can optimize parent sanity as much as possible, even though that's oftentimes, the last factor we consider. Our next question is: what's the best way to manage bedtime when siblings have different sleep needs or schedules? This is a really common question across households because what you'll see frequently is that a younger sibling, for example, will try to have the bedtime that their older sibling has, even when we know that, say, a younger sibling might need more sleep than the older sibling, or vice versa. We have good friends who are neighbors of ours where their daughter is a few years older than their son, and yet she goes to bed probably 30 to 45 minutes earlier than their son does because she just has different sleep needs. A lot of this is talking to kids about those sleep needs. And if you live in a two-parent household, also perhaps contrasting the parents' needs for sleep, where we can say to a kid, look, I know that you have this need for sleep. I know your sibling might have a different level of sleep. Maybe that causes you frustration. Maybe that causes you, to feel certain feelings. Of course, those feelings are welcome. But at the same time, as a parent, it is my job to make sure that you get what you need for your wellness, be that food, hydration, sleep, moving your body, love and support, whatever that might be. And As much as we can, we're messaging to kids that we can listen to them about their thoughts and their sleep needs and their sleep schedules. But at the end of the day, we're going to set those boundaries. We're going to set those routines and we're going to let them know, what we think is necessary, even if it's a different routine for each sibling to make sure that they get the sleep they need that, translates to being best able to be emotionally regulated with friends, best able to invest in their school curriculum, any number of things. Our second to last question on this sleep Q&A episode. My child keeps getting out of bed over and over again after lights out for water, hugs, emergencies. How do I get them to actually stay in bed? This question really relates to our earlier question in the episode about stalling around bedtime, because I think this is oftentimes the stalling that parents are thinking about is it's lights out, I have left their room, they're supposed to be sleeping, and suddenly I hear a little pitter patter of feet, and they're going to get water, or they're coming out and saying, "Oh, can I have one more hug?" in that plaintive little child voice, which is, both pulls on our heartstrings and also makes us want to pull our hair out. Or they have a particular emergency, something that they need or can't live without and actually fall asleep. What we say to parents in this situation is first, there's the antecedent focus that I referenced earlier in the episode. Let's set them up with as many things right next to their bed that are those things that they might decide they need to leave the bed for. If they need a drink of water, if they need a tissue, whatever it might be. Both of our kids have a cup of water, tissues, their sheets tucked in, and their loveys right there at all beds because those have been the most common emergencies. I mean, I would say the most common emergency is the loss of a lovey. And both of our kids have two loveys. That's our maximum because otherwise the loveys crowd them out of their beds. So, first is just antecedents. We try to set the situation up for success. Secondly, you can go with your affection and your verbal reinforcement for helping them to stay in bed. So if you think about it as you've got, say, 7 nights in a week, if your child stays in bed well, 3 of those nights, and 2 of those nights sort of gets out of bed for an understandable excuse, and 2 of the other nights has emergencies that make it so you're very frustrated, I would think about putting a lot of your verbal attention on the 3 nights they stay in bed, a little bit of your verbal attention on the 2 nights that they have mild, things that go on, and trying to just kind of ignore and lead them back to bed as much as possible on the 2 nights when they seem to have, bigger emergencies or bigger stalling episodes. Because what we're saying to a kid is if my attention is at all reinforcing of you getting out of bed over and over again after lights out, other than these tangible reinforcers of water or, other things, I'm going to minimize my attention on the nights when you're, really making me feel frustrated. Maybe that can become a conversation at breakfast in the morning. And I'm going to throw a party on the nights where I really am proud of you for staying in your bed or for being able to kind of go to sleep smoothly. That equation, just putting that emphasis for a lot of kids helps to increase the behaviors that we like to see of kind of going to bed smoothly and maybe not getting out of bed over and over. For some parents, they need some extras. So it might be that we have the kid working toward a small reward for a certain number of nights, staying in bed with, say, either zero moments getting out of bed or maybe one. We try to meet the kid where they're at in terms of where they can be successful and then raise the bar over time. And then for some kids, if it's really disruptive, or if it's waking up a sibling, or it seems like it's serving some other behavioral function where they just don't want to go to sleep. And so they're trying to do as much as they can to stay out of bed for as long as they can. Then sometimes we'll say to parents, this is a moment where you can reinforce it if they really stay in bed. But if they get out of bed a number of times, you might need to impose a consequence and say, look, honey, we're not going to have a huge discussion about this at night. I don't plan on screaming. I don't really want to, you know, be yelling at you or getting too frustrated. I'm just going to say to you if there's, a moment when you get out of bed, either a certain number of minutes or a certain number of times, you've lost this privilege or you've lost this particular thing. And then what we do is we see how over time, if we keep that framework in place where kid stays in bed, we throw a party. Kid stays in bed a number of nights, we might reinforce it with a privilege. And kid gets out of bed and really stalls or kind of makes us very frustrated behaviorally, we set that boundary, we give that consequence. That framework will usually shape a kid's behavior over time towards staying in bed for longer and longer periods and more reliably. Our last question for the Q&A episode. Should I let my kids stay up and sleep in on weekends, or does that ruin sleep for the rest of the week? This question is one where it kind of comes down to what you want to weigh as the major factors in your family. It is true that if you are to talk to sleep specialists or Dr. Shelby Harris, as we did last week, They're going to tell you the consistency in sleep wake times is fantastic for getting the sleep you need, for keeping your sleep schedule consistent, for making sure that your sleep is of high quality, all those things. So we might be able to say that to adults where we say, look, as much as you might enjoy sleeping in, it may even be better for you during the week if you're going to sleep and waking up at about the same time. We say that to everybody. We say that to teens. I say that to college students a lot because one of the quotes that I use oftentimes with college students is I'll say, like, you're going to bed at this time during the week for classes and waking up at this time. And then on the weekend, you're going from maybe going to bed at midnight and waking up at 8 to suddenly going to bed at 4 a.m. and waking up at noon. That's as if you're flying from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States and back every single weekend, just flopping across 3 time zones and then flopping back, on Monday. And that is inevitably going to wreak havoc on your sleep and on your body's expectations for sleep and ability to kind of calm down at certain times of the day. What people will report is if they notice, and I do this myself, where I really focus on making sure I'm in bed and I'm a little bit of a night owl, a little bit after midnight each night, and I wake up usually around midway through the 7 o'clock hour each day. What you will find about what my body has done is that around 12:30, even on nights if I want to stay up late, I pretty much shut down. And no matter how late I'm trying to sleep, my body generally will wake up at 7:30 just to see if we're supposed to get up now, because that's how we've trained it. So that discipline really does help with sleep cycles and making sure that you get as much sleep as you need. But at the same time, what's true of adolescence is that society is not structured for their sleep and the way that their circadian rhythms change. Adolescents tend to see a sleep shift during that developmental period. And one of the things that Dr. Harris also speaks about a lot is that we have difficulties in the way that we set up high school for adolescents, where we often have a very early start time for high schools, sometimes even earlier than middle schools or elementary schools in the district, when in fact sleep cycles are the opposite. That elementary schoolers tend to get up earlier, high schoolers tend to go to bed later and want to get up later. But instead of adapting school start times to those developmental changes, we kind of go the opposite direction. So it's already a little bit harder for teenagers who might be developmentally more likely to stay up late and wake up late. And we keep telling them it doesn't matter. You need to keep to society's schedule. So, in that sense, this is where parents are often weighing the fact that teenagers really like feeling that freedom and that autonomy on weekends to stay up late and govern their own sleep, even as we know it can have that effect on their hygiene. And if a teenager says to us, I'm really having a lot of difficulties with sleep, that will be a time when we are more likely to focus on saying, can we make your weekends a little bit more regular and consistent in terms of sleep? So, with that, thank you so much for listening to this point through all of the questions that our listeners submitted to the Thriving Kids podcast for sleep. Thanks to our listeners for sending such thoughtful questions. If you're looking for more tips or ready to use tools, you'll find them in our show notes for the Thriving Kids podcast and at childmind.org. Next week, I'll be talking to one of the most brilliant voices in the youth mental health space, Dr. Lisa Damore, about teens, adolescence, that as a growth phase, and all the kinds of challenges that parents can face alongside their teens, and how we can best be supportive of all of the different stressors and developmental tasks that happen during adolescence. It is a vibrant conversation full of wisdom, not to mention a vast library of resources that Dr. Lisa Damore has built up free of charge to parents on her website, which I'm very excited for everyone to see in our show notes for that episode. So, with that, if you have questions you'd like us to answer in a future Q&A episode, comment on our social pages or email us at podcast@childmind.org. I'm Dr. Dave Anderson. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Thriving Kids podcast.